Okay, we're gonna see if we can finish up these book reviews. The video cut off yesterday talking about this book, 1066. It's about the Norman invasion. If you're curious as to why the Normans invaded Britain, who William the Conqueror is, read this one. It's very short. Before that, I read this book called Standing Rock, Lakota, Nakota Nation. Is by Donovin, Arleigh, Sprague, and Rylan, Sprague. A lot of people were talking about Standing Rock. People were visiting it, the res. But who's reading about it? You know, who are the people? What is their place like? So I read this book. It's got a lot of pictures. This is a really good thing about this book. It even has a picture of the rock itself, that Standing Rock is named after. Yeah, pretty interesting. If you want to actually read something about Standing Rock. There is a book out about the fight against the Black Snake, but I haven't gotten my hands on it yet. Before that, I read this book called La Reforma Dizque Educativa by Rius. I picked this one up in Jalisco when we were down there last year. I've read a lot of Rius's books, so this one is actually pretty disappointing. It's mostly text. It barely has any pictures, as you can see. Usually his books are very informative, and this one had a lot of history about the different movements to reform education in Mexico, but it didn't have almost anything concrete in detail about the current educational reform, Peña Nieto's reform plan. And then the last couple of chapters are basically just like rants that don't have anything to do with anything. So I think Rius, God bless him, I think he's getting old though. If you're going to read Rius, read a different book. Before that, I read this book called Time, History, and Belief in Aztec and Colonial Mexico by this guy named Hassig. This is about the calendar. I was doing a lot of study about the calendar, the Mesoamerican calendars, and this one is pretty good. It really upsets some of the more traditional notions. Basically, he has a political interpretation of the calendar. Why the Mexica introduced the sixth sun, for example. It's saying it's political. The control and manipulation of time has to do with who has political power in a given time and place. So a little bit unorthodox, I think, as far as calendrical studies go in Mesoamerica, but very enlightening nonetheless. Good book. Before that, I read this book called 9 Lives of a Black Panther by Pharr. May he rest in peace. Elder Wayne was a LA Panther. And this is basically just his personal story about how he grew up in LA, joined the Panthers. Starts out in the sewers, kind of interesting. Doesn't really talk much about any of the other, parts of the SoCal chapter, like Riverside San Bernardino, where we know there was Pomona, where there was chapters, and apparently Elder Wayne was involved. And it gets into his later part of his life, where he gets into real estate and helps poor people get land. So one way of fulfilling one of the points of the platform, right? If you're interested in LA history, especially LA radical history, you got to read this book, 9 Lives of Black Panther. Before that, I read this one. It's called Even Heaven Falls Apart by Brian Wilkes. They call him a Skeeter Indian, part Cherokee. He's the guy that talks about the Cherokee calendar. A lot of people say that this is unorthodox too, that the Cherokee don't count their days the same way in a similar way as the Mesoamericans did. But the arguments that he makes are somewhat convincing. But of course, it's rooted in the Cherokee, religion, worldview, not so much the Mesoamerican one. Part of the calendar studies, different perspective. Interesting. Before that, I read this book called The People of San Manuel by Clifford Trafser. This is about the Serrano people who live at San Manuel. Also got some pretty good pictures. Focuses more on modern history. Their efforts to develop the reservation. Talks about the orchards and stuff they had there, even before there was casino. And this, there's not much written about our community, our native communities here. The Cuya Serrano, Yuhabiatum, the local Tongva people. This is one book that is out there. It's published by Malki Museum Press. So if you're studying the Native communities in this area, definitely read this book. Before that, I read this book called The Serpent and the Goddess. This one is a definitely must read, especially those of you who are interested in feminism, interested in European history, especially like pre-modern history. This book talks about how basically patriarchy displaced religions that had powerful women as figures, as holy figures, as goddesses. It talks a lot about, it's broken up into 3 sections: Eve, Mary, and Bridget. Yeah, this one really blew my mind when I read this book. Very interesting, especially for the history of Ireland, but the history of patriarchy in general.